Good afternoon. I'm Doug Floyd. If you haven't had me before, this is a quick little introduction to our scripture class. And so I look forward to spending time with you in the class. I will not be there this Thursday, uh, and I apologize for that. I had planned to be there, but I have a medical procedure that I couldn't avoid, so I'm going to have to be present for there. But I'm going to go ahead and make this video to get us started for the year and already help you begin to think about uh, reading the Bible and discussing the Bible. And the last thing I want this class to be is boring. Some people are like, oh man, the Bible could be. Some people might be intimidated by the Bible normally because they haven't read it, and they think it's boring. Or as I've talked to some students, well, have you read the Bible? No, well, yeah, I read the Book of Revelation, and then of course the Bible might be scary because Revelation one really needs a knowledge of the whole book of the whole Bible before you ever get to that story. Otherwise, people misread it and turn it into a Stephen King novel, which is, I can assure you, that's not what it is. So we're going to talk about reading the Bible, thinking about the Bible, reading stories, and hopefully in an interesting way. I have a bowl of fruit here. I hope I don't bother you. I'll keep me going. Okay, so we're going to look at the Bible, the big world of the Bible, or you might say the strange world of the Bible. First, we're going to think about hearing it, reading it, and hearing it. I sent a link, and I can try to send it again if you need it. But Bible Gateway, you can listen to any part of the Bible. There is something to hearing versus reading. If you can think throughout time, most cultures heard it; they didn't read it. And they certainly didn't read it silently. For most of church history, I will say much of church history, not most of church history, but for much of church history, people read it out loud when they read. They read anything out loud. People didn't read silently. I know it seems odd to us today since we read silently, but people didn't always read silently. So they read out loud. So people got in the habit of hearing things and think about right now, versus hearing me speak or if you read what I'm saying. If you read what I'm saying, it will actually look a little jumbled because when we talk, we're not writing in complete sentences. We're not talking that way. We're interrupting ourselves actually when we talk. And so it sometimes reads, I get transcripts from when I speak. And of course, and I'm often shocked at what I read because the way we talk is very different than what we hear. So hearing is very important in the history of the Bible. But obviously writing was too, because there are clear techniques in the way stories are written, poetry is written in Scripture that we're going to look at a little bit. Okay. This is not a hermeneutic class, and hermeneutic would be like sort of the art and science of reading. But this is not what this class is about. This class is about storied Scripture, about hearing the stories of Scripture and how stories talk to each other. And so I like to teach literature and how one story interacts with another story. You can see the influence of Shakespeare and Charles Dickens. Okay, you can see different writers talking to each other across time. Certainly, when you read Dante's Inferno, or Dante's Comedy was the actual title. If you ever read that, and I hope you do, it is interacting with all the literature of the ancient world, and so he's in a conversation with other stories, and that kind of thing is happening in the Bible. Okay, stories are talking to each other, and we're going to look at that, how stories work, and these are stories of a specific community. Okay, so these are stories of the ancient Hebrews, and so we're gonna talk a little bit then. So in a way, what we're going to do together is read and talk, and your reactions and your questions are going to help me learn. So I always take this class with the open-mindedness that I'm going to learn from you and you're going to learn from me. We're going to learn together. I'm going to give you some guidance. I'm going to tell you up front that how I read the Bible. So I don't read it as a historian, although there is history in it. I read it as a minister. I'm an Anglican priest. Okay. So I approach it as a minister. But I'm not going to try to tell you. Each of you come from different faith communities, different churches. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in class. I'm going to ask you just so that we know where each other's coming from. That's the only reason. Or you may not even come, you may come from, you may not go to church, and that's fine too. But you're still coming from a non-church community then. That's what you'd be coming from. But you're coming from you already come from some kind of community, some family. You weren't born without a family. So we come from a family and a way of thinking and a way of talking. And that influences the way we hear the Bible. So the way the people who, the Old Testament, which is what we'll focus on this semester, we're talking about the ancient Hebrews, an ancient community that was often surrounded by much more powerful nations. They were never a big community, and their existence was often fragile. And yet, the Jewish people are still here. It's pretty amazing. So we're going to think about that a little bit. How story shaped this community, and how, if you can understand the way they read the stories and the way Christians tend to read these stories, they're not just stories, but that how through these stories that the Creator, God, spoke to them, addressed them, challenged them, called them, rebuked them. And so this ongoing relationship between the Creator and his people. So we'll look at that and discuss that a little bit. And then this same way of thinking takes place in the church, which is the word church, called out ones, a community of people that have been called out. They feel they've been called out by God, and have been formed into a community, and they gather. And one of the things they gather around is the stories of Scripture. And when I say stories, I'm using it in a big way, because the Bible's filled with all kinds of writing. In one sense, all kinds of genres. If you go into a bookstore, you've got all kinds of genres. Okay, you might have philosophy, history, poetry, science fiction. Okay, you have all sorts of how-to books, maybe. So the Bible's filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of writing. So there are stories, there are songs, many times poetry in the ancient world and stories are together, so that many ancient stories are some kind of poetry or song. There are aphorisms. The book of Proverbs is lots of short little wise lines. Okay, so there's what we call wisdom writing. So there, and these would also be classified under instruction. Very clear instruction writing, which is Torah or law, is instruction. Okay, so there is instruction, but there's also remembrances. There's a recount of rituals that people did, rituals and feasts, celebrations, and even the kinds of structures that they worshiped God in, the tabernacle and the temple, and so this plays a role in it. And so all this, some of that has to do with remembrances, the way people remembered things. So when I say the word memory, most people first off think about something, a picture in their head. They're remembering a story. But if you can imagine, the ancient Hebrews, when they're remembering, what am I doing right now? I'm eating a fruit salad. They're remembering through what they eat. Okay? So the food tells a story. And the specific kind of food you choose to eat at a specific time tells a specific story. I mean, it's not like I eat that food and suddenly I'm thinking about a story, but it is a series of memories. Okay? I'll give you an example. At Christmas, let's see, what do people like to eat at Christmas? Maybe a gingerbread house. Okay, so there's a story behind that bakery item, or ginger snaps, or candy canes. Okay, so there's food associated with a set of memories that have to do with a holiday that is actually part of the church year. Okay, the birth of Christ. Okay, so all these are combined. And so you have food, song, um, probably gathering, family gatherings, and all these are forms of memory. And they're all remembering a story, an ancient story. And sometimes they're just having a good time together as a family. But then sometimes these stories open up. These little experiences open up into a bigger story, and we begin to see maybe something to do with the birth of Christ and the incarnation in a new light. Okay? So that is how memory works in the Bible. It is involved tangible. All five senses are at work. So we're going to think about that and talk about it a little bit. So we're going to read stories. I want you to keep a notebook. So you respond to the stories. You respond to what it is you're reading and what questions it has, or things you don't like about it, or things you like. I want you to be perfectly honest with me. If it's boring or whatever it is, I want you to be perfect. Questions, there's no question that's outside the limits. And we're going to understand, we're going to start thinking of Scripture. There's a big story going on across all these books. And we're going to try to think about that bigger story. And as well as thinking about individual stories and how they work and how some of the poetry works. So there's certain ways, certain things that the Hebrews like to do in their poetry and how they write that's helpful to know. And so that will get us into some of the tools. The primary thing I want you to do is read. You're not trying to memorize techniques or this or that, but you will get exposed as we go to some of the tools that the church has used across the years to think about Scripture and to talk about Scripture. And so we're gonna talk about that in class. And then one interesting about the Bible was throughout history, people have read the Bible in light of their own story. In fact, across the edges, you hear different people using this kind of language. That somehow as they read the story, they're a part of the story. In fact, that is kind of the way memory works in the Old Testament. I'll give you an example. The people are freed from slavery in Egypt, and they're led eventually to the Promised Land. And so now they're told that both with these feasts they have, the parents are to recount to the children the memory of being freed from slavery. But they're telling the story in such a way as generations pass, so maybe 100, 200, 300 years from then, they're looking back to being rescued from Egypt, and they're telling it in first person. I was a slave in Egypt, and I was freed, and here's how God freed me. So they're telling these stories in a really odd way, a different way, because obviously they didn't live in Egypt. They lived somewhere else, but they're telling that story firsthand. I was a slave, and I've been freed. Now, here's the fascinating thing. We get to the New Testament, Paul's doing the same thing. He's saying, I was a slave. You were a slave. We were slaves. We've been freed from Egypt. And so he's taking the story and personalized it. And so we're going to look at that way of thinking about stories, which you may or may not be used to doing. That's how the Bible works. People personalize it, and it becomes part of their own story. And it becomes a way that they say God is calling them out through the Word. So we'll think about all those different kinds of connections, our story, biblical stories. And then we don't have time to read everything, unfortunately. But I have created sort of a layout here. We'll begin. We'll see what we can do here. This is this semester. And we're going to start out reading Genesis. And so Genesis is so important that we're going to slow down a little bit with Genesis. And we're going to start out reading what I've put as creation stories and uncreation stories. There are stories of God creating things, and then there are stories of things falling apart, uncreation stories. So we're going to read those stories and talk about them, and what's going on with some of those stories. And then recreation stories. So we're going to think about that the first week. I don't know if we can get through all of it, but we're going to see what we can do. Creation, uncreation, recreation. We're going to think about that, Genesis 1 through 9. So read that for August 26th, and we'll begin discussing that. I will also be sending you a little questionnaire that since I won't be there, I'll ask you to email me the questionnaire back. But I ask you to also come to class with the answers so that you guys can. Someone will be there to help facilitate a discussion on that, and hopefully we'll have a good time this year reading these classes, reading the Bible. I hope you'll get a lot out of it. Have a lot of both, maybe a lot of questions, a lot of answers, a lot of maybe it will connect with you in a way that it did to me, that caused me to study it the rest of my life. It's become a part of my daily habit because I find there's so much in it. So I look forward to the semester with you, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.